So, here's the deal. I never intended to get myself into this mess. It all started as a joke between me and my buddies. We were hanging out one night, throwing back some beers, and talking about all the weird stuff you could find on the dark web. You know, just guys being guys, trying to outdo each other with stories of freaky things we'd heard about online. I didn't really believe half of it, but I was intrigued. That's where my story begins. I guess you could say I'm naturally curious, maybe a bit too much for my own good. The dark web always seemed like one of those urban legends to me, a place where you could buy anything, no matter how insane or illegal. But it wasn't until that night, sitting around with my friends, that I decided to actually dive into it. My friend Mike dared me to go deeper than any of us had before. He wanted me to buy something truly bizarre, and being the competitive idiot I am, I took him up on it. I spent the next few days preparing, setting up my VPN, downloading Tor, and learning the ropes of how to navigate the dark web without getting caught. It was a rush, a weird thrill that had my heart pounding like crazy. After a few missteps, I stumbled onto a site that was like a twisted version of eBay, complete with user ratings and comments. That's where I found it. A diary. The description claimed it belonged to the leader of a cult that was actively trying to summon Satan. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but I couldn't resist. The listing had this creepy photo of a leather-bound book, old and worn, with strange symbols burned into the cover. The comments were mixed, ranging from people calling it fake to others saying it was the real deal and that it had driven them mad. I figured, what the hell? I placed a bid, and to my surprise, I won the auction. It wasn't even that expensive, just a couple $100 in Bitcoin. I figured if nothing else, it would make a cool conversation piece or a good story to tell at parties. Besides, I was confident it was just some creative writing project, or a prop from a low-budget horror movie. A week later, a package arrived at my door. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, and unmarked. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, revealing the diary inside. It looked just like the picture, old, leathery, and more than a little creepy. But the moment I touched it, I felt something I can't quite explain. A coldness that seeped into my fingers and made me shiver. I shook off the feeling and opened the diary. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, symbols, and sketches that looked like something out of a nightmare. I could barely read the spidery script, but what I could make out talked about rituals, sacrifices, and other things I won't even repeat here. I laughed it off at first, trying to convince myself it was a joke, but there was something about it that gnawed at me. That night, I decided to show it to my girlfriend, Sarah. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV, when I pulled out the diary and handed it to her. She flipped through the pages, her eyes growing wide with each turn. I could tell she was creeped out, but she also seemed fascinated. "This is insane," she said, looking up at me with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Where did you get this?" I told her the whole story, expecting her to laugh it off, but instead, she looked at me with a serious expression. "You should be careful with stuff like this," she warned. "You never know what kind of energy you're bringing into your life." I shrugged it off, but her words stuck with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing strange noises, whispers that seemed to come from the shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by too much beer and late-night horror movies. But then, things started happening. It began with small stuff, things that were easy to dismiss. Objects would move on their own, lights flickering for no reason, cold drafts in rooms with closed windows. I tried to ignore it, but there was an undercurrent of unease growing inside me. It was like the diary had a presence, something dark and hungry that was slowly waking up. One night, I woke up to find Sarah standing at the foot of the bed, staring at the diary. Her eyes were wide open, but there was something vacant about her expression, as if she was asleep but still awake. I called her name, but she didn't respond. It was only when I touched her shoulder that she seemed to snap out of it, blinking and looking around in confusion. "I was dreaming," she mumbled, climbing back into bed, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't remember what the dream was about, and I didn't press her, but the incident left me feeling rattled. I started to wonder if maybe there was something to the diary after all. I decided to do some research, hoping to prove to myself that it was all just an elaborate hoax. I spent hours scouring the internet for information about the cult, the symbols, anything that could shed light on what I'd gotten myself into. What I found only made things worse. The diary belonged to a man named Alistair Crow, a name that sent shivers down my spine. According to the stories, he was a notorious cult leader from the 1970s who vanished without a trace. His cult was said to have performed horrific rituals in an attempt to summon dark forces, leaving behind a trail of disappearances and deaths. The more I read, the more uneasy I became. It was as if the diary was a magnet for darkness, drawing in negativity and chaos. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd unleashed something I couldn't control, something that was slowly creeping into my life. One night, as I was sitting alone in my apartment, the lights went out. It was sudden, plunging me into complete darkness. I stumbled around looking for a flashlight when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal lurking in the shadows. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, using its light to scan the room. Nothing. Just my overactive imagination, I told myself, trying to calm my racing heart. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The diary was changing things, twisting reality in ways I couldn't understand. I knew I needed to get rid of it, but something held me back. A morbid curiosity, a desire to see how deep the rabbit hole went. I told myself I was being stupid, but part of me was drawn to the darkness, like a moth to a flame. That's when I decided to document everything. Maybe it was a way to process the fear, to make sense of the madness that was unfolding around me. Or maybe I just needed to warn others, to let them know what they might be getting into if they ever stumbled across something similar. I don't know how this is going to end, but I can feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I've started to hear whispers in my sleep, voices that speak in a language I can't understand. They're getting louder, more insistent, and I can't shake the feeling that something is coming for me. The diary sits on my desk, a silent sentinel watching over my descent into darkness. I know I should destroy it, but part of me is terrified of what might happen if I do. It's a puzzle, a mystery that I'm determined to solve, even if it means risking everything. If anyone's reading this, I just want to say, be careful what you wish for. Curiosity might lead you to places you're not prepared to go. I'll update again when I can, but for now, I need to figure out what to do next. The darkness is closing in, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. A couple of days after I wrote the first part of my story, I started noticing changes in my apartment. It wasn't just the weird noises or flickering lights anymore. I would come home to find my furniture rearranged, like someone had been in there moving things around. My bookshelf would be overturned, and the kitchen chairs stacked in bizarre configurations. It was like I had a ghost with an interior design degree. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of my friends messing with me after reading my post. I called Mike, thinking he might be the culprit, but he denied everything. And I believed him. There was a nervousness in his voice, like he didn't even want to talk about it. He told me to get rid of the diary, to burn it or throw it in a river, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Sarah noticed it too. She'd been staying over more often, and she could sense the tension in the air. We were sitting on the couch one night, watching a movie, when she suddenly turned to me and said, "You need to do something about that book." I could tell she was scared. Her eyes darted to the diary every few minutes, as if expecting it to leap off the table and attack us. I tried to reassure her, but I knew I wasn't being convincing. The truth was, I was scared too. That night, she stayed over, and I ended up on the couch, unable to sleep. The shadows seemed to creep closer, and I felt this oppressive weight bearing down on me. It was suffocating, like I couldn't breathe. I found myself staring at the diary, and before I knew it, I was opening it again. The pages were filled with more symbols and sketches, but this time, something was different. I swear I could see the ink shifting on the pages, the symbols twisting and writhing like they were alive. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped through the book, each page more disturbing than the last. There were detailed instructions for rituals, each one more grotesque than the one before. Animal sacrifices, blood rites, things that made my skin crawl just reading about them. But it was the last few pages that really got to me. They were filled with names, hundreds of them, and I recognized some of them. People I'd read about in the news, missing persons cases, unsolved murders. It hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some fictional diary, it was real. The cult was real. These were people who had disappeared, who had been killed, and the diary was keeping a record of it all. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was going to throw up. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat there, clutching the diary like it was a ticking time bomb. I didn't know what to do. I was in way over my head, and the weight of it all was crashing down on me. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see shadows creeping up behind me. I was jumpy, on edge, and Sarah noticed. She sat me down and demanded to know what was going on. I told her everything, about the names, the rituals, the feeling that something was coming for me. She listened, her face pale and drawn. I could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. Determination. "We have to do something," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "We can't just let this go on." I nodded, knowing she was right. We decided to do some digging, to see if we could find out more about the cult and its history. Maybe there was a way to stop whatever was happening. We spent the next few days researching, piecing together what we could from the scattered information online. It was slow going, but eventually we uncovered more about Aleister Crowley and his followers. They called themselves the Black Dawn, and they were infamous for their brutal rituals and dark magic. They believed in summoning demons to gain power, and they'd left a bloody trail in their wake. There were rumors that the cult was still active, operating in the shadows, but nothing concrete. It was like chasing ghosts, and every lead seemed to hit a dead end. But one thing was clear. They were dangerous, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their secrets. The more we learned, the more terrified I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the diary had drawn attention to us. I started seeing figures in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. One night, I woke up to a noise outside my window. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. I slowly turned my head, and there, outside the window, was a face. It was pale and distorted, eyes black as coal, with a wide grin that stretched impossibly far. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me questioning my sanity. The next morning, I found claw marks on the window frame, deep and jagged, like something had tried to get in. I showed them to Sarah, and she turned white as a sheet. It was real. This was all real. I knew then that we had to get rid of the diary, but how? I didn't know what would happen if we tried to destroy it, and I was terrified of unleashing something even worse. But there was no choice. We had to try. We made a plan to take the diary to a remote location, somewhere far away from the city. Maybe we could bury it, burn it, do something to sever its connection to us. I hoped it would be enough, that we could put this nightmare behind us. But as we packed up the diary and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was like there were eyes everywhere, watching, waiting. The air felt heavy, charged with a sense of impending doom. I didn't know if we'd make it out of this alive, but we had to try. We couldn't let the darkness win, not without a fight. So, after everything that had happened, Sarah and I were ready to end this nightmare once and for all. We had a plan. Take the diary far away and destroy it. It seemed simple enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something would go wrong. The whole situation had a finality to it, like the climax of a horror movie. I just hoped we'd make it to the credits alive. We picked a spot about an hour's drive from the city, a desolate stretch of forest known for its isolation. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would go willingly, which made it perfect for what we had in mind. We packed a backpack with supplies, a lighter, some accelerant, a shovel, and set out just after sunrise. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking behind us. The drive was tense. Sarah was gripping the steering wheel like it was a lifeline, her knuckles white. The diary sat between us on the seat, a constant reminder of everything we'd been through. I swear I could feel its presence, like it was taunting us, daring us to try and destroy it. We didn't talk much on the way there. What was there to say? We were both scared out of our minds, but we knew this was the only way. When we finally reached the forest, I felt a chill run down my spine. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us like grasping fingers. We parked the car at the edge of a narrow dirt path and set off on foot. The woods were silent, save for the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. After walking for what felt like an eternity, we found a small clearing. It was the perfect spot, secluded, far from any trails, with enough space to work. We wasted no time getting started. I dug a shallow pit while Sarah gathered some dry branches to use as kindling. Once everything was ready, I took a deep breath and opened the backpack. The diary seemed heavier now, as if it was trying to anchor itself to this world. I handed it to Sarah, and we shared a look, both of us knowing this might not end well. "Ready?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the diary. I could see the determination in her gaze, but also the fear. She struck a match, and for a moment, it seemed like the flame wouldn't catch. But then it did, dancing hungrily in the cool morning air. I doused the diary with the accelerant, and Sarah dropped the match into the pit. The fire roared to life, and we stepped back, watching as the flames licked at the diary. I half expected it to scream, to fight back, but it just lay there, smoldering. For a moment, I thought it was working. The edges of the pages curled and blackened, the leather cover blistering in the heat. But then, something shifted. The flames flickered and dimmed, as if they were being snuffed out by an unseen force. I felt a cold wind whip through the clearing, and the fire sputtered, nearly going out. We both stared in horror as the diary seemed to glow, the symbols on its cover pulsing with a sickly light. It was as if the book was drawing power from the darkness around us, refusing to be destroyed. "What the hell?" Sarah gasped, stumbling back. I grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the pit as the diary began to levitate, rising above the flames. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, and I felt a pressure building in my head, like a vice tightening around my skull. We watched, helpless, as the diary floated higher, the pages flipping wildly. I could hear whispers again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices chanting in unison. It was the same language I'd heard in my dreams, guttural and alien. Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light, and the diary fell back into the pit, the flames reigniting with renewed intensity. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I could feel the darkness closing in, a tangible force pressing against us. "We need to go!" Sarah yelled, and I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from the clearing. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. Behind us, the forest erupted into chaos. I could hear trees snapping, the ground splitting open with a deafening roar. It was like the earth itself was rebelling against us, furious at our attempt to destroy the diary. We stumbled out of the woods and back onto the dirt path, breathless and panicked. I glanced back, half expecting to see the trees closing in behind us, but everything was still. The only sound was the distant crackling of the fire, now little more than a smoldering ember. We climbed into the car, our hands shaking as we fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we tore out of there, the tires kicking up a spray of dirt and leaves. Neither of us spoke as we sped down the road, the adrenaline slowly wearing off and leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew we'd failed. The diary was still out there, somewhere in the ashes of that clearing, waiting for the next fool to find it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the darkness had marked us somehow. Back at my apartment, we collapsed on the couch, too drained to do anything but sit in silence. The weight of what we'd done, what we'd failed to do, hung over us like a shroud. I didn't know what to do next. All I could think about was how close we'd come to losing everything. I knew one thing for sure. The diary was more than just a book. It was a conduit, a doorway to something far beyond our understanding. And we had barely scratched the surface of its power. I didn't know if we'd ever be free of it, but I wasn't going to stop trying. Whatever it took, I was going to find a way to end this, once and for all. After that terrifying night in the forest, Sarah and I were left reeling. It felt like we'd barely escaped with our lives, but the darkness that had seeped into our world wasn't going to let us off that easily. The diary had survived, and somehow, I knew it was still out there, waiting. The uneasy feeling that we were being watched never went away. We spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every shadow and whispering about what to do next. The sense of dread was overwhelming, like a storm cloud hanging over us. I kept trying to convince myself that we'd done enough, that whatever power the diary held would stay buried in the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Sarah suggested we find someone who knew more about the occult, someone who might have answers. It seemed like our best shot, so we started reaching out to anyone who might be able to help. Forums, online communities, anything that mentioned the cult or the diary. We hit dead ends more often than not, but eventually we got a reply from someone who claimed to know about the Black Dawn. The message was cryptic, but it provided a glimmer of hope. It came from a user with the handle Oracle23, and it directed us to meet at a small, out-of-the-way cafe on the outskirts of the city. It sounded sketchy as hell, but at that point, we were desperate. The day of the meeting, I could feel the tension mounting. Sarah and I drove to the cafe, nerves frayed, hoping this wasn't a trap. The place was nearly empty when we arrived, a small diner with flickering neon lights and an atmosphere that screamed forgotten. We slid into a booth, scanning the room for anyone who might be our mysterious contact. After a few minutes, a woman approached us. She was older, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. She introduced herself as Catherine and motioned for us to follow her to a back table. Catherine wasted no time getting to the point. "You've encountered something dangerous," she said, her voice low and serious. "The diary you found, it's more than just a relic. It's a vessel, a means to channel dark forces." Her words sent a chill down my spine, confirming what I'd feared all along. She explained that the Black Dawn was a cult unlike any other. Their practices rooted in ancient rituals designed to summon entities from beyond our realm. The diary was a guide, a tool used to bridge the gap between our world and theirs. "The spirits attached to the diary won't let go easily," Catherine warned. "They've marked you, and they'll do everything they can to reclaim what was theirs." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Catherine paused, her expression grave. "You can't destroy it through normal means. You must sever the connection between the diary and the entities it calls upon. There's a ritual, one that requires certain ingredients and sacrifices." She gave us a list of what we'd need: black salt, sage, and an obsidian dagger, among other things. The ritual would have to be performed at midnight during the new moon, a time when the barrier between our world and theirs was thinnest. It all sounded like something out of a horror movie, but we were willing to try anything. The days leading up to the ritual were a blur of preparation and paranoia. We managed to gather everything we needed, but it wasn't easy. Each item seemed to come with its own set of challenges, like the universe was conspiring against us. The new moon finally arrived, and we returned to the forest, the weight of our task heavy on our shoulders. The clearing looked different now, more ominous, as if it remembered what had happened before. We set up everything according to Catherine's instructions, drawing a circle with the black salt and placing the dagger at its center. The air felt charged, electric with anticipation. I could feel the darkness pressing in around us, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. As the clock struck midnight, we began the ritual. I recited the incantation Catherine had given us, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Sarah followed my lead, her hands trembling as she lit the sage and waved it around the circle. The ground beneath us trembled, and a cold wind whipped through the clearing, extinguishing the candles we'd set up. I could hear the whispers again, louder and more insistent, like a chorus of voices raised in anger. Suddenly the air shimmered, and I saw figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct and shifting. They were drawn to the diary, their faces twisted in rage and hunger. I felt a surge of terror, but there was no turning back now. "Finish it!" Sarah shouted, her voice barely cutting through the din. I grabbed the obsidian dagger, its weight cold and heavy in my hand, and plunged it into the center of the diary. The ground erupted in a blinding flash of light, and I felt a force ripple through the clearing, a shockwave that sent me stumbling backward. The whispers rose to a crescendo, then cut off abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. When I opened my eyes, the diary was gone, reduced to ash and scattered by the wind. The oppressive presence that had hung over us was lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. We'd done it. We'd severed the connection. Sarah and I sat in the clearing, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened. I could feel the weight of the past few weeks lifting, the darkness receding like a bad dream, but I knew we'd never be the same. The experience had changed us, left scars that would never fully heal. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see shadows lurking behind us. But the forest was still, peaceful even, and I knew we were finally free. or so I hoped. The drive back from the forest was surreal. The oppressive sense of fear had lifted, but Sarah and I were both silent, lost in our own thoughts. It felt like we'd been through a war, emerging on the other side battered and bruised but alive. I wanted to believe it was over, that we were finally safe, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Back at the apartment, the atmosphere felt lighter. The shadows didn't seem to loom as large, and the oppressive energy that had hung over everything was gone. Sarah and I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but relieved. We'd done what seemed impossible, faced down the darkness and lived to tell the tale. But despite the victory, I couldn't fully relax. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends that didn't sit right. I spent the next few days trying to piece together everything that had happened, hoping to find some semblance of closure. I reached out to Catherine again, wanting to thank her for her help and see if she could shed any light on what we'd experienced. She replied with a message that was both comforting and cryptic. "You've severed the ties that bound the diary to this world, but be wary. The darkness you encountered is not easily forgotten. It may seek new ways to manifest, and there are those who would seek its power for their own ends." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to believe it was over, but the idea that the darkness could find another way to return was terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still connected to it somehow, that it might come back to haunt us when we least expected it. Sarah seemed to be handling things better than I was. She'd thrown herself back into work, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. I envied her ability to compartmentalize everything, to push the fear aside and move on. But for me, it wasn't that simple. The memories lingered, replaying in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. A few weeks passed, and things slowly began to return to normal. The nightmares that had plagued me since we first found the diary began to fade, and the sense of unease that had gripped me loosened its hold. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd managed to put it all behind us. But then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and Sarah was asleep beside me. I was dozing, caught in that strange space between wakefulness and dreams, when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a soft whisper, coming from somewhere in the apartment. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The room was silent, but the whisper came again, insistent and familiar. It was the same language I'd heard in my dreams, the same guttural chant that had haunted us since we first found the diary. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and followed the sound. It led me to the living room, where I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the room, was the diary. It looked exactly as it had the first time I'd seen it. Old, worn, and filled with a malevolent energy. I stared at it, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. We'd destroyed it, hadn't we? It couldn't be real. I reached out, my hand trembling, and picked it up. The leather was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of fear through me. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with their insidious chant. I stumbled back, dropping the diary as a wave of nausea hit me. The room spun, and I felt like I was being pulled into a dark vortex, a whirlpool of despair and madness. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in the darkness, but eventually, a soft voice broke through the haze. It was Sarah, shaking me gently, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I blinked, the fog lifting as I looked around the room. The diary was gone, and the whispers had faded into nothingness. It was as if nothing had happened, but the lingering fear told me otherwise. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, trembling and terrified. Sarah held me, her presence grounding me in reality. I knew then that the darkness wasn't done with us, that it would find new ways to torment us. The diary was just a conduit, a means for the darkness to seep into our world. Even without it, the malevolent energy was still there, lurking in the shadows. We decided to move, to put as much distance between us and the past as possible. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only way to protect ourselves. We packed our things and left the city, hoping to start fresh somewhere new. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. The shadows seemed to stretch out behind us, and every now and then I thought I saw a figure lurking just out of sight. It was a reminder that the darkness was always there, waiting for its chance to return. We settled into a new town, a small place far removed from the chaos of the city. It was peaceful, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. But I knew better than to let my guard down completely. The experience had changed me, made me wary of the unknown. Sarah and I tried to rebuild our lives, but the memories never fully faded. They were like scars, reminders of what we'd been through and what we'd lost. But we had each other, and that was enough to keep the darkness at bay. In the end, I realized that the diary was just one chapter in a much larger story. The darkness we'd encountered was a force beyond our comprehension, one that would always exist in some form. But we'd faced it and survived, and that was something no amount of fear could take away. As I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder if the darkness will ever find us again. But if it does, we'll be ready. We've learned from our mistakes, and we know now that we're stronger together than we ever were alone. For now, all I can do is live my life and hope that the shadows remain just that, shadows. But deep down, I know that the darkness is always watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when it does, we'll be ready. We have to be.